What if the most dangerous book in history was never meant to be read with your eyes? What if it couldn't be burned because it had no pages, no author, no title, only whispers? What if this so-called Book of Shadows slipped through the Inquisition's fingers again and again, not because they couldn't find it, but because it found them first? And what if you sitting here now were never meant to hear its name aloud? Oh, too late. So breathe slowly. Let the weight of modernity fall from your shoulders. The lights are dim now. The fire has gone out. And in the ash, something lingers. Tonight, we'll search for the book the church tried and failed to erase. But remember, shadows are not cast by darkness. They are born of light. There was a time when books were more dangerous than blades, when ink could cut deeper than any sword, and when simply possessing the wrong manuscript could end your life in the public square, bound, gagged, and broken beneath the righteous blaze of the stake. The Inquisition wasn't a moment. It was a system, a centuries-long network of surveillance suppression and sanctified paranoia. At its center was fire cleansing, purging absolute. But fire, for all its hunger, cannot devour what it cannot grasp. Hidden within the margins of forbidden libraries, whispered between dying breaths encoded into trial testimonies and cloistered dreams, lies the trace of something unspeakable. Not quite a grimoire, not quite a gospel. A manuscript that moved like rumor, that survived without surviving, burning in every town but living in none. It has no agreed name, no catalog entry. But the ones who feared it most called it the Book of Shadows. And tonight, with quiet steps and gentle breath, we will follow the trail it left behind. From ash to archive, from codex to confession, from Montségur to the vaults beneath Rome. Because what the Inquisition tried to silence still speaks. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The Inquisition did not arrive with fire, it arrived with paperwork. Before any flames licked at parchment, before ink curled into ash, there were lists, inventories, orders. The Church, in its pursuit of heresy, did not act blindly. It documented everything, from the names of suspects to the titles of their crimes, even down to the last syllable of blasphemous texts. It all went into ledgers so precise they make modern bureaucracies look like disorganized book clubs. If a text was condemned, it was written down. If it was destroyed, that destruction was recorded. No fire burned without a receipt. That's what makes the Book of Shadows so strange. For something so feared, so whispered about in confessions and testimonies, it never appears in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books. Not once. And yet inquisitors spoke of it in letters. Torture victims described it under duress. Priests burned for heresy referenced it moments before their death. Somehow everyone knew of it, but no one officially acknowledged it. The Index, first published in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, was meant to be the Church's firewall, a comprehensive list of every dangerous book one should avoid if one hoped to keep both soul and skin intact. Over the centuries, it grew to include works by thinkers like Galileo, Luther, Erasmus, even books on mathematics and astronomy, should they dare to place logic above doctrine. But not all condemned texts were listed by name. Some were simply described: a certain grimoire bound in human skin, a gospel in the tongue of the devil, a codex that teaches light through inversion. These ambiguous references hint at something the Church didn't dare name. Or perhaps something it couldn't. Inquisitorial records from Toulouse, Lyon, and Seville all mention a shadow text passed from hand to hand among heretics. Some accounts describe a book wrapped in ash-colored cloth, its writing invisible unless read by candlelight during the waning moon. Others speak of pages that rearranged themselves after each reading, rendering memorization, and therefore condemnation, impossible. One Milanese trial notes that the accused had no possession of the book, but claimed it walked behind him. Hyperbole, surely. And yet how many separate trials across centuries referenced something eerily similar? Historians tend to laugh nervously when confronted with such accounts. The rational explanation is always copyist error, exaggeration, or the fevered delusions of the condemned. But a small handful, the stubborn or the curious, depending on your point of view, believe these records point to something deliberate. A manuscript or collection of manuscripts that slipped through the church's fingers. Not because they didn't try to find it, but because it defied being found. There is precedent for such things. The Cathars, for example, were known to preserve their sacred texts, not in libraries, but in living memory. Their Book of Love was passed orally, transcribed only during rare initiations. The Bogomils, too, encoded their Gospels within hymnals and liturgical chants, transforming sacred music into spiritual code. What if the Book of Shadows followed the same model, always real, but never stable enough to pin down? And then there's the curious case of the so-called Inventory of the Burnings, a ledger compiled by a Dominican friar named Matteo Ferrara in the early 1500s. Ferrara's list, still preserved in a crumbling monastery outside Siena, includes nearly 500 titles destroyed by fire under inquisitorial decree. Each entry includes the book's name, author, contents, and the location of its execution. One line, however, stands out. Entry number 87 reads simply, "An unnamed work, origin unknown. Inflammable. Burned, but left no ash." Left no ash. Now that might be poetic flair, or it might be something else. Some modern scholars argue that this phrase referred to the nature of the book's paper, or the oils it had absorbed over time. Others suggest it was metaphorical, that the ideas inside couldn't be destroyed, even when the physical text was gone. But a smaller, quieter circle of researchers takes the phrase literally. A book that refused to burn, or worse, a book that burned and came back. And that's where things get sticky. Because if such a book existed, a work immune to the church's primary tool of censorship, then all the indexing in the world would be for nothing. What good is a ban if the text ignores the flames? It's worth noting, too, that the church was meticulous with its logs, except when it wasn't. Many inquisitorial records were lost to time war or political purges. Others were simply never filed properly, especially in territories with decentralized ecclesiastical authority. Spain's Inquisition, for instance, kept separate ledgers from Rome, and within those records lie strange anomalies. Blank pages, torn margins, inked-out names. Scholars investigating these inconsistencies sometimes discover traces of references to a liber obscura, a codex tenebris, or in one case a book of phantoms in which no doctrine is written, but all are felt. Sound familiar? So the question remains, if the church was so effective at burning books, why do traces of this one keep surfacing? Why is there no single title, but dozens of eerie synonyms? Why do scattered records from inquisitions, hundreds of miles apart, echo the same dread, as if they'd all heard of the same thing, but were forbidden to speak of it directly? Perhaps it was a myth, a cautionary tale told by monks to scare one another from the edge of heresy. Perhaps it was a real manuscript that changed hands so quickly and so secretly it never left a record. Or perhaps, and this is the part that raises both eyebrows and blood pressure, it was never a single book at all, but a process, a technique, a whispered ritual recorded differently each time it appeared. And if that's true, then all those ashes and indexes, all those fires and ledgers, may have only made it stronger. Because the more they tried to name it, the deeper it sank into shadow. And shadow, as you've probably noticed by now, is very hard to burn. Montségur was not merely a stronghold. It was a sanctuary, a final breath for a movement hunted to extinction. Perched high in the Pyrenean mountains, it was the last refuge of the Cathars, a sect so determined to preserve what they believed was divine truth that they chose fire over submission. In 1244, after a brutal 10-month siege by church-aligned forces, over 200 men and women descended the slope beneath the castle walls and stepped willingly into flames. What they left behind is what concerns us now. In the ashes of Montségur centuries later, archivists uncovered a curious inventory. Not a military ledger, not a list of prisoners. A book list barely intact, singed at the edges, written in a mix of Occitan and Latin. Among the catalogued items were treatises on dualism gospels rejected by Rome and texts attributed to the early Gnostics. But one line stood apart. It referred to una cosa nera, senza nome, translated loosely as a black thing without a name. No title, no author, no contents described. Just that phrase and a note beside it in a more hurried hand, hidden before the surrender. Now scholars have argued over this line for decades. Some claim it was a scribe's shorthand for an unnamed object, a vessel perhaps, or a relic. Others suggest it was a codex so dangerous its very title was forbidden. But the term cosa nera has shown up in one other place, a Cathar prisoner's confession from 1253 preserved in Toulouse. The man described a black book of no name that was wrapped always in cloth, never touched by light. He said it was read only once a year by moonlight, and that it contained instructions for release. When asked to explain, he said simply, "Not release from sin. Release from matter." That single phrase sent shivers through the Inquisitor's notes. To the Cathars, flesh was corruption, the material world a prison. Salvation meant escape from the physical, not redemption within it. A book promising that kind of freedom would be the ultimate heresy. The implication is troubling. If such a text did exist, and if it were deemed too dangerous to name the Church's silence on it, might not be oversight, but strategy. What cannot be named cannot be hunted. What cannot be catalogued cannot be condemned. Interestingly, in this same Montségur inventory is another anomaly. 3 entries are written in reverse, the only place in the document where the scribe used mirror writing. One, scholars believe, refers to a Gnostic gospel. The other 2 are indecipherable. One begins with the word umbre, yes, that word, a possible early citing of the so-called Codex Umbre, which will surface later in our story under more troubling circumstances. But here it floats silently in the background, a shadow among ruined names. It should also be noted that the inventory doesn't say these books were destroyed. Quite the opposite. The line hidden before the surrender appears twice, once beside the unnamed object and again beside a different, clearly titled text. This implies intentional preservation, a hiding ritual perhaps, or a network of believers tasked with smuggling sacred books past the siege line. And there's more. In 1921, a French historian named Léon Magnier uncovered a trail of oral traditions passed down among rural families near Montségur. Grandmothers, farmers, and former shepherds spoke of the Black Story or the night prayer, allegedly whispered from generation to generation. It involved no standard scripture, just images, a door made of smoke, a mirror that doesn't reflect a voice that calls in sleep. None of it sounds like liturgy. All of it sounds like residue. Magny's research was dismissed, of course. Too folkloric, too speculative. But fragments of his interviews match curious symbols, etched into the walls of an abandoned cellar near the castle. 7 concentric circles scratched into stone, a motif we'll encounter again. Perhaps these weren't merely symbols of protection. Perhaps they were a code, a map, or a warning. So the puzzle deepens. A vanished book with no title. An inventory that records it without describing it. A siege that ends in fire. And the suggestion, subtle, buried, but persistent, that something slipped through. Something wrapped in cloth, hidden before the final surrender. Left to wait perhaps for hands not yet born. Modern researchers still debate whether the inventory is authentic. Handwriting analysis confirms its age, and the ink matches pigments used in southern France during the mid-13th century. But the phrasing, the fear baked into the margins doesn't feel like forgery. It feels like a whisper. Like someone trying to say just enough without saying too much. And it brings us to an uncomfortable possibility that the Book of Shadows may not have survived in spite of the Inquisition, but because of it. That the effort to destroy it gave it form. That the secrecy surrounding it made it more powerful, more persistent, more real. When we think of books, we think of words bound between covers, pages you can turn, titles you can recite. But what if this book refused all of that? What if it was never meant to be opened in daylight? What if its truths were designed to be hidden, not because they were shameful, but because they were too liberating to survive? Somewhere beneath Montségur, a book may still rest, wrapped in old cloth, waiting for the right reader, or perhaps waiting for you. The Inquisition feared words, yes, but it feared ink more. Because ink once dried had permanence. Words could be denied. Memories could be twisted. But the mark on the page that held power, and worse, it could travel. Ink spread messages across borders. It crossed into the hands of heretics and sympathizers. It leaked through abbeys and back rooms and butcher shops. And sometimes it did something even more dangerous. It changed color. In a dim vault beneath the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence, a folio lies under glass. Charred around the edges, warped with water damage, but still legible. Its script isn't Latin, though its letter forms almost resemble it. It's written in what scholars call a convergent cipher, a language stitched together from fragments of Hebrew, Syriac, Latin, and Occitan. And the ink, well, the ink isn't quite ink. When ultraviolet light passes over the page, the writing glows a sickly green. It's not pigment. It's reactive, a compound mix of iron, gall, myrrh, resin, and something unidentifiable, possibly a fungal enzyme. Lab tests suggest the ink was designed to fade entirely in daylight, but reappear under candlelight, especially in warm, humid air. In other words, the ink responds not just to light, but to breath, to presence. One line deciphered only recently refers to the breath of the page. The implication is unmistakable. This wasn't ink meant to be read by accident. This was designed for ritual, for revelation. The folio bears no title, but it includes a curious marginal note, umbrae ductus, roughly translated drawn by shadow. The same phrase appears in a 14th century Dominican exorcism manual, not as scripture, but as a warning, beware the letters drawn by shadow. For they speak in dreams, and sleep shall become doctrine. Forensic paleographers point to the peculiar spacing between words, the alternating pressure on the quill, the occasional mirrored glyph. One theory holds that the scribe may have been blind, not physically, but spiritually. Copying not from sight, but from memory trance or dictation, which, depending on your perspective, is either an artistic marvel or deeply unsettling. A competing theory suggests the scribe wasn't a person at all, but a community. that the folio was a collaborative act of reproduction by a brotherhood of underground scribes, each trained in the same symbolic system, none of whom ever saw the complete work. This would explain the inconsistencies in stroke pressure and formatting and why no two surviving fragments ever seem to agree entirely. But here's where it gets stranger. In 1983, a Belgian chemist named Dries van Motten stumbled upon a near-identical ink composition while cataloging artifacts in a forgotten Jesuit cellar in Ghent. He found a sealed box labeled ad interim, meaning for the meantime. Inside, a dozen small vials wrapped in cloth, each containing a thick, viscous substance. Notes beside them claimed the contents were used for heretical detection. That was their phrase, not application, not reproduction. Detection. So what kind of ink lets you detect heresy? Van Motten's theory, controversial but compelling, is that certain inquisitors believed the ink carried memory, that when applied to pages once used for forbidden texts, it would react, revealing ghost words. Ink that revealed what had been erased, what had been hidden. Shadow writing. The idea was dismissed by the academic community, as most fantastical ideas are. But Van Motten didn't mind. He was a chemist, not a theologian, and he published one peculiar observation. When a sample of the ink was left near an open flame for more than 2 minutes, the liquid began to bead, not bubble bead, and arranged itself into a shape resembling a double-ringed circle, a symbol that, as it turns out, also appears in 3 other unrelated fragments thought to be part of the Book of Shadows. We're not dealing with a single ink recipe here. We're dealing with a technology, one meant to obscure, to hide in plain sight, to reveal only under the right conditions, like breathing on a mirror, like reading in your sleep. And then there's the question of who taught this. An obscure letter from an inquisitor in Toulouse dated 1321 complains bitterly of ink from the East being used to corrupt young scribes. He refers to it as Eastern blood and claims it sings when heated. That's not metaphor. He follows with, when brought near fire, it sings low like a throat cleared. Whether this was auditory hallucination, chemical reaction, or poetic terror, no one can say. But the detail is too specific to ignore. And this brings us back to the earlier folio, the one with the mirror script. Its final page contains an illustration barely visible now. A candle held before a page, the flame reflecting in what appears to be a silver bowl. The reader is faceless, robed. Above them a line is etched, only the unseen may see. That's the game, isn't it? A text that doesn't want to be read unless you know how. Ink that vanishes unless breathed on. Symbols that lie dormant until summoned. A manuscript that behaves like memory, ghosting, flickering, refusing. But more curious still, every time the folio has been tested, its composition changes slightly. The same ink in different climates behaves differently. Sometimes the writing glows. Sometimes it blisters. Sometimes it simply waits. And so we are left with the uneasy realization that this book or its pieces may have been designed to survive not by being preserved, but by being elusive, by refusing translation, by writing itself differently each time it was copied, by ink that learns. You wouldn't expect a 17th century Jesuit to confess to being afraid of a book, not in public, not in writing. And yet, in a small, unsigned letter discovered tucked inside a crumbling archive in Avignon, there it is a priest admitting that a certain manuscript made him tremble while dreaming and whisper aloud words he had not learned. The letter is dated 1682. Its author claims the text was borrowed briefly from a Spanish collector and returned within days. He refers to it not by title, because of course it had none, but by sensation. He calls it that which hums when no sound is present. This hum is not metaphorical, apparently. Several other sources reference a similar phenomenon. One German trial record from 1607 describes a grimoire that sang to the accused as she slept. Another from Naples in 1711 says the text spoke in syllables that vanished upon waking. Dream language, auditory hallucination, possession, or something more curious. A few fringe linguists propose the idea of glossolalia, the spontaneous, often trance-induced utterance of unknown sounds or languages. Most associated with Pentecostal religious fervor, but with roots far older and arguably more heretical. What if the Book of Shadows didn't simply contain knowledge but acted as a conduit for altered states, a primer not for reading but for surrender? The concept is not without precedent. In Tibetan spiritual traditions, certain scrolls are read aloud, not for their literal meaning, but for their vibrational impact. Words as frequencies, reading as tuning. And what makes the Book of Shadows especially unsettling is that it seems to trigger similar experiences across vastly different cultures. A trial from Krakow in 1599 records a monk speaking in an unknown tongue for 3 days after merely touching a black-bound codex. He was unable to recall the event and died shortly thereafter. The book, curiously, was never found. There's a term that appears sporadically in these testimonies, verbum lucis, the word of light. Some believed that speaking the book's contents aloud, even unintentionally, activated something. Not a demon necessarily, but a shift, an opening, a dream layered onto waking life. One Jesuit described it as wading waist-deep through someone else's thoughts. Modern neuroscientists might suggest sleep paralysis, dissociative states, or even mass hysteria, all fair interpretations. But then what do we make of the marginal notes found in a burned folio from Salamanca? They aren't content summaries or corrections. They're records of dreams. Scrawled beside paragraphs in red wax pencil are entries like, "He stood at the end of the hall again, and the door was open, but it did not lead outside." This was not analysis. It was tracking. The suggestion, of course, is absurd, that the book didn't just express ideas, but implanted them. That to read was to be read. To engage with it was to offer yourself up as a page. There's a specific phrase found in 3 trial transcripts nearly a century apart. The page turned itself. To a rational ear, that means wind, trickery, stagecraft. But the accused were often uneducated, unversed in drama. Their testimonies, uncoached and often terrified, describe pages that moved while eyes were closed and words that rearranged to match the listener's name. Folklore, perhaps. Hallucination. Or a manuscript not designed to be fixed, but responsive. Consider this: a 17th century mystic named Sister Domenica of Sardinia once wrote of a black book that taught in silence. She said, "The book waited for me to sleep, then entered." During her waking hours, she claimed it looked blank, but when her eyes were closed, its pages appeared images made of flame and fog and curiously mirrors. Her abbess dismissed the visions as demonic attack. Domenica was exorcised, starved, and eventually faded into obscurity. Yet fragments of her writings survive, and they include a sketch, 7 circles nested inside one another, and at the center a flame shaped like an ear. You begin to see the pattern. The Book of Shadows, or whatever form it truly took, was not simply a text. It was an interface, a ritual in disguise. Read it with the wrong eyes, and it remains inert. But under the right conditions, moonlight breath intention, it might open. Not physically, psychically. The whispered pages weren't made to be translated. They were made to be felt. One of the more chilling accounts comes from a Spanish nobleman, Gaspar de Viedma, whose diary from 1706 describes a reading that gave no words, only warmth, as if the paper exhaled. He claimed that for days after, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched by the page. He ultimately sold his entire library and entered a monastery. The book he wrote belonged to no one and asked not to be returned. So what are we left with? A handful of scorched fragments, trial records filled with dream logic, descriptions of words that whisper, pages that wait, ink that speaks when no one else is speaking, and a growing suspicion that some books aren't meant to be owned, only experienced. If the Inquisition hunted this text, it wasn't to destroy knowledge. It was to silence something alive, something that doesn't stop once it's been read, something that listens back. Names hold power. That was the Church's reasoning when it named heresies, named the condemned, named every title it saw fit to burn. To name something was to define it, to isolate it, to undo it. But the most feared book of all, the one never entered into the index, refused to offer its name until, strangely, it did. And even then, only in whispers. The earliest recorded instance of Codex Umbrae appears in a Vatican side ledger dated 1312, a quiet footnote among far more violent records. Amidst references to confiscations and burnings, one entry in a scribe's hand notes one codex origin uncertain, possibly Iberian. Designated Umbrae by Factor Salvatore, awaiting further discernment. There is no further mention of it in that volume. The name appears and vanishes. But Factor Salvatore was not a minor figure. He served on the inquisitorial tribunal during the early operations against the Cathars and had a reputation for his unsettling composure during burnings. In a preserved letter to his superior, he speaks of a black volume that would not let me sleep and claims its pages mirrored more than memory, they mirrored intent. He doesn't use the phrase Codex Umbrae again, but he refers repeatedly to the text I dare not name aloud. He believed it to be older than the Cathars, older than Rome, older than Scripture itself. He feared it not because of what it said, but because of how it seemed to know when he was reading it. A century later, the name reappears. A transcript from a witch trial in Avila 1429 includes the accused reciting lines she claims were from the Codex of Shadows. When asked how she came by the name, she replied, "It whispered it." Under torture, she repeated that the book had no title until it was opened. Then she said it told you its name. It chooses. Of course, that could be theatrical nonsense. Hysteria. A woman inventing stories to delay death. But the phrasing is precise. The idea of a book that doesn't bear a title until it interacts with a reader and then reveals it not printed but perceived suggests something far more complex than parchment and ink. Later records suggest the Codex Umbrae was considered a code word among underground scribes. A Lisbon registry from the 1500s confiscated during a papal raid lists multiple banned works under abbreviations. One column is labeled UM. The corresponding titles are left blank, just numbers, as if naming them would summon them. This use of obfuscation of naming as anti-naming fits the pattern we've seen. When knowledge is dangerous, it's not the possession of it that damns you, it's the recognition, the naming of what should not be known. The Codex, as it was called, became a kind of ghost label assigned to that which could not otherwise be defined. A floating placeholder for fear. The only surviving page claimed to belong to the Codex Umbrae surfaced in a private Swiss collection in 1893. The page was blank to the eye, but under certain kinds of heat, faint impressions emerged, not words, but shapes. Rings within rings. Lines that spiraled inward until they resembled not symbols, but an eye. Scholars dismissed it as fraud, an elaborate joke from the collector. But in the margins, nearly microscopic, someone had etched 3 words, scriptum per umbras, written by shadows. That phrase echoes something we've already seen, umbrae ductus, drawn by shadow. Either we're chasing a consistent fiction, or there's a truth so carefully encoded that it exists only in echoes. One obscure clue comes from a destroyed monastery near Tarragona. In a side chapel amid frescoes blackened by fire, a single stone plaque survived. On it, the inscription reads, In umbra scriptus est et verba eius in somnis veniunt. Translated, it is written in shadow, and its words come in dreams. The inscription is surrounded by spiral carvings, 7 in total. Again, the circles. Again, the motif of hidden layers. At this point, even skeptics have to admit the persistence is remarkable. Multiple centuries, multiple geographies, similar descriptions. A manuscript that may or may not exist, but is always feared, always hidden, always referred to by a name that is more concept than title. And perhaps that's what it is. A concept. A myth wrapped in paper. A projection of the Church's deepest anxieties, not about blasphemy, but about losing control of the narrative. About a text that writes back. About a name they could not own. There's a saying among rare book dealers, the most valuable texts are the ones no one admits to having. In the case of the Codex Umbrae, this may be literally true, not only because of its scarcity if it exists, but because of the price of naming it. Ownership is risk. Recognition is danger. Silence, perhaps, is survival. Still, the name endures. Even now, in forums frequented by collectors of arcane manuscripts, the term umbrae carries weight. It means handle with care. Or perhaps don't handle at all. Because names are not neutral. Some are invitations. Others are warnings. She had been silent for 40 years. Sister Benedetta, once a novice at the convent of Santa Lucia near Milan, took her final vows in 1437 and spoke rarely thereafter. Her piety was praised, her devotion unquestioned. But when pneumonia struck in the bitter winter of 1479, something inside her broke, or perhaps opened. As the fever surged, so did her memories, and what emerged during her final hours was enough to frighten even the hardened cleric sent to record her confession. She spoke of a book, not one shelved in the convent library, not listed in the monastery's ledger. This book had no place, no record. And yet she claimed it lived there, hidden beneath the altar of the defunct crypt chapel, a space no longer used, its floor half-collapsed. Its relics moved years earlier. She said the book was wrapped in red cloth, warm to the touch and never cold. She said it arrived in silence and left the same way, and that the sisters who read it did so only once, and only in pairs, lest the mind divide. Her testimony, captured shakily by a scribe who annotated his own discomfort in the margins, contains this haunting phrase: "It taught us to dream with precision." She described the act of reading not as interpretation, but as transmission thoughts that bypassed understanding and became experience. The book, she said, gave not knowledge but vision. It closed your eyes with words and opened them in sleep. When pressed to describe its contents, she refused. Not out of secrecy, she claimed, but inability. There are no words, she whispered. Only folds. This strange metaphor reappears later in the confession. It folded my thoughts into others. I saw faces that were not mine, speaking truths I did not know. To some, this sounds like the mutterings of a fevered mind. To others, those who followed the trace of the Book of Shadows, it sounds uncomfortably familiar. The convent denied the existence of such a text. The crypt was sealed, Sister Benedetta was buried, and the church moved on. But not all records were erased. A traveling Benedictine named Paulus Fulgentius visited the convent 2 years later and wrote in his journal, "The nuns do not sing at Vespers. They breathe it. Their rhythm is unnatural too, even too rehearsed, as if reciting from memory not prayers, but commands." He also described a peculiar smell in the chapel, something between myrrh and old fire. A scent, if you recall, already associated with the forbidden text, described in Ferrara's burning records. No physical trace of the book was ever officially recovered. And yet in 2003, a restoration team, examining the ruins of Santa Lucia, found beneath the collapsed altar a small iron box. Inside were 2 items, a length of frayed red fabric and a scrap of vellum etched with 7 interlocking circles. No text, no title, just the symbol and one faint word at the center umbrae. It's easy to doubt. After all, dying confessions are messy things. Memory warps, under fever time collapses. But Sister Benedetta's description of folded thoughts of dual consciousness, shared vision, aligns too closely with other accounts to ignore. What's more, her claim that the book arrived unbidden is echoed in an earlier 14th century case in Toledo, where an anchoress claimed a text appeared by dream, then by door. She awoke, she said, with the smell of smoke in her cell and a folded cloth on her chest. Whether that was delusion or ritual delivery remains unknown, but again, the folds. Modern psychologists might interpret these testimonies as manifestations of psychological stress, collective repression, or the effect of prolonged isolation. And they would be right to a point. But that doesn't explain the consistency of detail, the way these visions echo across generations and geography, each unaware of the others, yet repeating the same motifs. And then there's the convent's own ledger found in a municipal archive long after the building itself collapsed. One entry from 1442 lists unscheduled absence of 2 sisters for 3 days, returned confused, no discipline administered, no explanation, no names, just absence, confusion, and silence. As if what happened in those 3 days existed outside the bounds of record. The Church took Benedetta's confession seriously, too seriously. The fact that it was recorded at all suggests someone somewhere recognized the danger of what she described. Not because they believed it necessarily, but because it matched other things, other whispers, other untraceable anomalies. It's the repetition that haunts. The same folds, the same scent, the same symbol, the same feeling that the book isn't read but encountered, not opened but revealed, that it is not a static object but a presence. When asked in her final moments if she feared damnation, Sister Benedetta is said to have smiled weakly but without hesitation. "There was no evil in it," she whispered, "only the kind of truth we are not meant to keep." Then she died, and whatever she had seen, whatever had once passed between her and that unnamed book, passed with her. But the scent lingered, just faintly, in the chapel, in the box, in the story. Some truths burn, others whisper. They were ghosts in cassocks, names without titles, hands without records. A loose, silent chain of scribes who operated beneath the floorboards of history, and without them, the Book of Shadows may have never survived at all. Officially, their existence is undocumented. No seals, no correspondence, no ecclesiastical orders. But their fingerprints remain scattered across centuries and languages united by a single trait: they never signed their work. The Church had always feared unauthorized reproduction. From the moment it realized that ink traveled faster than fire, it guarded scriptoria with vigilance. Only approved hands could copy holy texts. Only authorized monks could bind and seal scripture. Yet even within those walls, beneath the golden illumination of sacred gospels, something darker was at work. Margins filled with sigils, inverted verses, letters written backwards or in mirror, signs that someone else or some group was using the tools of salvation to replicate something the Church desperately wanted to forget. The evidence is circumstantial but cumulative. Across monastic libraries from England to Aragon, scholars have catalogued a recurring anomaly pages stitched into unrelated volumes with odd ink and alien scripts, always just one or two sheets sandwiched between psalms or theological commentaries. Sometimes the inserted pages are blank to the naked eye. Sometimes they bear diagrams, circles, spirals, knots with no accompanying text, and in a few rare cases they hum faintly when turned. That detail, by the way, has been confirmed in a 1987 Vatican Preservation Lab report. The explanation was static electricity. The archivist, however, refused to touch the page again. The idea is this: the Brotherhood, if we may call them that, didn't produce books as we think of them. They planted fragments, cells, embers, pieces of a larger ritual that only made sense when assembled, or when read by someone who knew how to find the rest. Their intent was not mass distribution. It was survival through dispersion. Consider a peculiar codex housed in the Bodleian Library, dated 1491, a medical text officially. But it includes an appendix that makes no sense, a sequence of numbers and shapes that form no known diagnosis or recipe. The manuscript is unsigned, but analysis shows 3 distinct handwriting styles, none of which match the rest of the book. The ink, too, is different, faintly metallic, and the vellum used is older than the rest of the codex by almost a century. Someone inserted it, quietly, precisely, intentionally. This method of survival, the fragment model, recalls Jewish mystical traditions, where divine names are hidden within larger texts, or the early Christian use of acrostic gospels. It also echoes Cathar practices of distributing knowledge orally, ensuring that no one custodian could betray the whole. Knowledge fractured to remain whole. Sound familiar? A scholar named Maria Tejada has proposed that these scribes operated through what she calls inklines, networks of monastic contacts, who quietly moved illicit texts between abbeys, disguising them as repair work or anonymous marginalia. She points to a 15th-century scriptorium in Genoa, where over a dozen books bear identical watermarks in their added pages, a 7-ringed seal embedded beneath the parchment. The same seal appears on the binding thread of a lost Book of Hours from Ghent, and on a graffiti carving behind an altar in Normandy. Always the 7 rings, always unclaimed. Tejada believes these marks are not decoration, but authentication, a way of signaling to future readers, this page matters. Look again. Maybe not now. Maybe not yet. But soon. Skeptics argue that the Brotherhood is a modern fiction, a construct created by imaginative researchers eager to stitch coincidences into conspiracy. They point to the lack of primary documents, the absence of first-hand accounts. But what else would you expect from a group whose survival depended on never being named? In 1562, during a book purge in Lisbon, a Dominican friar named João da Costa reported discovering a strange page in the spine of a corrupted lectionary. The page contained a drawing of 2 figures kneeling before a mirror with the phrase, "The text is not the teaching. The eye is not the seer." Da Costa's superiors dismissed it as marginalia from an earlier scribe. The book was burned, but Da Costa copied the image into his personal notebook, which survives. The mirror, the figures, and beneath them, faintly 7 circles. Even more intriguing is the testimony of a French inquisitor named Arnaud Lévy, whose 1544 journal includes this lament, "I burn the hands, but not the ink." The words come back in silence, written anew by those I cannot name. The idea that the Church knew something larger was afoot, something networked, ephemeral, and immune to fire, suggests a war far more patient than we imagined. We must also consider the notion that the scribes were not rebels but defectors, trained by the Church, educated in its languages, entrusted with its secrets. And then quietly, they walked away not to destroy it, but to preserve what they believed had been lost. Not dogma, but vision. Not control, but awakening. The Brotherhood may never have met face to face. They may have lived centuries apart in silence. But their work formed a living architecture, fragments of the Book of Shadows seeded like spores across the manuscripts of Europe waiting to take root. And perhaps that was the only way it could have survived. Because a book that cannot be found in whole cannot be burned in whole, and a message that lives in many hands speaks longer than any fire. The Church was confident in its methods. It knew how to make a heretic speak. Rack, rope, flame each had its place in the Inquisition's vocabulary of persuasion. But during the witch trials of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, a curious pattern began to emerge. Women and occasionally men accused of sorcery described rituals, incantations, and teachings that could not be traced to any known book. No malleus, no grimoires, no packed scrolls. And yet their accounts were uncannily similar. In the small German town of Bamberg in 1629, during a frenzy of witch persecutions that claimed over 600 lives, a woman named Elsa Kramer was interrogated under suspicion of summoning storms. Her confession included the phrase, the words folded behind the page. She insisted she had read them not in a book of spells, but in the black fold, a volume with no spine, no title, no ink. When asked what this meant, she said simply, "It speaks when alone." The inquisitors, perplexed, wrote it off as madness. But Elsa wasn't alone in her wording. Across the Rhine, a trial in Rouen in 1631 produced another such account. A midwife accused of diabolism claimed that during a fever a book appeared by her bedside. She never opened it. It opened to her. "I could feel the pages," she said, "but they were not made of paper. They felt like breath." She recounted seeing symbols she could not understand, yet somehow recited not aloud, but into the air. The records list this as an internal delusion consistent with spiritual attack. But the margin notes include one word scrawled hastily by the clerk Umbre. The Inquisition, despite its brutalities, was nothing if not methodical. It built elaborate catalogues of forbidden knowledge, organized and archived with obsessive thoroughness. Everything had a name. Every sin, every object, every supposed tool of the devil had a place. But this book, this unnamed, untitled book, kept appearing in testimonies across decades, always described obliquely, always, as something unplaceable. The Church's own witchfinder guides like Malleus Maleficarum contain no reference to such a text, nor do the later Spanish and Italian manuals. And yet inquisitors began to insert cryptic phrases into private annotations, the unseen manual, the breath script, that which precedes incantation. These were not official designations. They were field terms, vernaculars of fear among those who'd heard the same words from too many lips. In 1674, a Carpathian monk turned inquisitor named Brother Anselm recorded the trial of a farmer's wife who claimed she had never spoken. A spell, never touched a wand, never worshipped a demon. Yet she knew with startling detail the structure of an invocation that did not exist in any book the Inquisition had ever seized. She described it like music phrases that changed depending on where you stood or what hour the moon had risen. Anselm, unnerved, concluded she carries no book, but something has carried the words to her. He called it the invisible catechism. From here, speculation takes root. Some scholars argue that these were remnants of pagan oral traditions, half-remembered chants and symbols preserved in memory long after their textual form vanished. Others suggest psychological contagion ideas seeded by torturous suggestion that spiraled into shared delusions. But both theories fail to explain one crucial detail: the consistency. The repetition of symbols, the recurrence of imagery, 7 circles, a black cloth, breath as text, the book that speaks alone. A particularly damning case comes from Seville in 1658 when a confessed witch drew unprompted the spiral glyph now associated with the so-called Codex Umbrae. She did not name it. She said only, "It arrived through the wall." The Inquisitor dismissed her as poisoned by folk belief. The drawing was archived and forgotten. But when that same glyph appeared centuries later in a margin of a folio discovered in Venice hidden inside a volume of ecclesiastical music, the pattern could no longer be ignored. The scribble was identical. The circles matched. The strokes mirrored. Was this book real then, not in the traditional sense, not a bound manuscript with chapters and indexes, but as an idea, a structure, a phantom template that bled between minds and ages, passed not through ink, but through dream and rumor, through agony and silence, a book that was never there and yet always present. It is possible, of course, that the accused were coached, that inquisitors described forbidden knowledge and suspects desperate for reprieve echoed what they were told. But that fails to explain the references that predated such interrogations, nor does it account for the precise recurrence of visual symbols across borders and languages among people who could not possibly have shared a source. Even stranger is the sudden halt in such references after the early 18th century. The Book of Shadows, if we may call it that, seems to vanish from confessions entirely. Not because it had been forgotten, but perhaps because it had succeeded, fragmented, hidden, dispersed beyond detection. Or more haunting still, because those who knew how to recognize it had learned not to speak. A book that cannot be named cannot be confiscated. A book that is never held cannot be burned. And a book that is not read, but remembered, that book never leaves. Some books speak not through chapters, but through margins. Not through ink, but through what was nearly erased. The more we dig into the whispers of the Book of Shadows, the clearer this becomes. If the text survived, it did so not in full form, but in ghost traces, sentences wedged into unrelated manuscripts, symbols hiding in the curvature of decorated capitals, phrases misaligned on the page as if added not by accident, but by intent. In 1976, a medievalist named Claude Beauchamp was cataloging a 14th-century psalter in Lyon when he noticed something odd. Every illuminated O in the manuscript contained 7 concentric rings. He initially assumed it was an eccentric scribe's decorative flair, but then he found similar rings inside a 12th-century liturgical calendar in Prague, and again in the corner of a marginal illustration from a German Book of Hours dated 1320. None of these scribes knew one another. None had any documented connection. Yet the same signature 7 rings, sometimes encircling an eye, sometimes simply hovering alone, appeared across time and language. It wasn't just decoration, it was a recurrence, a watermark in the very edges of orthodoxy. The margins of medieval texts were lively places. Readers annotated them, monks joked in them, scribes vented frustrations or mused about lunch. But in some cases, marginalia told a second story, one layered beside the official narrative, whispering a parallel truth. In a Franciscan volume from Toledo, the main text is a commentary on St. Augustine. But in the margins, a small hand has scrawled notes in a different ink, cryptic abbreviations, moon symbols, and once the phrase text behind the veil. The handwriting is hesitant, as if written in secrecy, and disappears halfway through the volume. But what's notable is the way the marginalia seems to respond to the text, not contradicting, but echoing mocking questioning, as though the page was a dialogue and someone had joined in from the shadows. In 2001, a team restoring a Dominican manuscript in Dubrovnik discovered a strange layering of pages. What appeared to be blank flyleaves when exposed to low raking light revealed faint impressions, not written, but pressed like the ghost of letters that had once lain atop them. The recovered impressions included spirals and the familiar phrase scriptum per umbras, written by shadows. These weren't intentional writings. They were bleed-throughs, echoes of books placed beside others, ghost texts. Even stranger, in some cases, the impressions didn't match any known book in the archive. Whatever had left its mark wasn't supposed to be there. There is an open question among textual historians about these artifacts. Could the Book of Shadows have been designed to be parasitic, not in the biological sense, but in the textual one? That is, instead of existing as a full standalone work, it was disseminated through interference by embedding lines, sigils, or images into other books. In this model, the book is never complete. It is glimpsed, suggested, constructed by accumulation. You read 50 texts and unknowingly absorbed the fragments, like a virus or an incantation. This isn't without precedent. The Kabbalistic concept of the Shevirat ha-Kalim, the shattering of vessels, proposes that divine knowledge can only be reconstructed from fragments. Similarly, Gnostic traditions held that holy wisdom was scattered deliberately to be retrieved only by the worthy. Could the Book of Shadows be a medieval echo of this idea, not a codex, but a condition? A single page from a 15th century breviary in Avignon features a marginal note. The pages speak sideways. It's a bizarre phrase, almost nonsensical, but beside it is a drawing a line curling from the edge of the text block into the margin, then doubling back like a serpent eating its tail. A loop, a fold. The same motif Sister Benedetta described in her final confession. And here's where the connection tightens. 3 marginal annotations found across different manuscripts. One from Florence, one from Krakow, and one from Bruges. All contain the same cryptic symbol, usually inverted a spiral, that terminates not at the center, but outside its own bounds. Scholars who've examined them side by side report something chilling. When the symbols are transposed over each other, they align, forming in composite a diagram. A map, perhaps, a code, or a sigil that only becomes legible through multiplicity. If so, then the Book of Shadows was never a single object, but a network, a layered transmission. Each reader receives a sliver. Each scribe leaves a trace. The book breathes through hands, not bindings, through margins, not titles. It would also explain why no complete copy has ever been found, because it never existed in one place. It was exiled into parts like a shattered mirror, distributed across the libraries of Europe. You couldn't find it unless you were looking everywhere, and perhaps, even then, only if it wanted to be found. That's the unnerving part. The way these fragments seem to respond, not just survive. How they echo ideas readers haven't yet encountered. How they draw eyes, whisper patterns, hint at a structure too large to grasp. What kind of book does that one that doesn't sit on a shelf? One that waits between the margins? Venice has always known how to keep a secret. Beneath its gilded altars and mirrored halls, the city trafficked in far more than spices and silks. It was a broker of ideas, dangerous ones. Exiled philosophers, silent printers, masked scholars all found refuge in the labyrinth of canals, where questions drifted like incense and names were whispered instead of written. It is here in the records of a forgotten private auction held in the spring of 1587 that a single breath-catching entry appears. One volume, leatherless, smoke-bound, marked with no seal. Language unknown. Buyer Castilian anonymous. Price 3 times that of a book of hours. No title, no description. Just those few details and the word fumado scrawled hastily in the margins, smoke-bound. The term appears nowhere else in the ledger. The auction took place in a noble's salon near the Campo San Maurizio, attended by collectors of rare heretical works. According to a surviving attendee list, one guest was a Jesuit scholar sent by Rome to observe. Another was a Jewish mystic known to circulate incomplete Zohar manuscripts. A third was rumored to have purchased a page from the Voynich manuscript years earlier. These were not amateurs. They were readers of forbidden things, and they knew what they were looking for. The seller remains unnamed, but a letter in the same archive, penned in a shaky, old-fashioned hand, mentions the passing of that book, whose touch sings ash. A poetic line, perhaps, but we've seen that phrase before. In a confessional from Seville, in a marginal note in Dubrovnik, and now in this letter linked to Venice. Descriptions of the object are sparse but consistent. No cover. Pages bound by smoke-treated cloth supposedly giving off a faint scent of burnt myrrh. The writing inside was said to shift, not morph, not animate, but respond. One collector writing years later recalled hearing from the buyer that the book's script arranged itself according to who held it. Another claimed it could not be opened unless held over a flame, and even then only briefly before the ink began to fade. Not disappear. Fade like breath caught on glass. You might dismiss this as rumor spun by collectors hungry for mystery. And yet when the buyer attempted to leave Venice with the book, a customs clerk detained him. The incident is recorded in a Port Authority journal, Strange Cargo. Pages smelled of oil and fire. Traveler spoke little. Book seized, returned, then allowed. The phrase "then allowed" is scratched over 3 times, as if someone tried to undo the line, or wanted it both erased and preserved. What happened to the book after that is anyone's guess. The buyer vanished from public record. No name, no further correspondence, but a Jesuit memorandum sent from Venice to the Vatican the following year includes this sentence: "One volume escaped fire again." Same signs, same scent. That it was still being tracked suggests the Church knew what it was, or at least feared that it might be what others claimed. There's also the testimony of a Venetian printer's apprentice dated 1592, who claimed to have seen a book that taught without words. He described turning its pages and hearing a low hum like bees in a jar, and claimed the script shimmered when viewed sideways. His master denied all knowledge. The apprentice was dismissed a week later, then vanished. His final journal entry, preserved in the printer's estate, reads, "It showed me the thing I never wanted to know. I had already read it in a dream years ago." What's fascinating is the way this volume, if it was indeed the Book of Shadows, or a fragment of it, was handled with such care despite its danger. No attempt was made to burn it. No decree declared it cursed. It was sold, bought, passed quietly, as if the buyers understood that to destroy it was impossible. Or worse, that destruction was a kind of permission. Scholars point out that no Venetian auction record before or after 1587 contains another item so vaguely described. Venice prided itself on inventory, on documentation, and yet here was a book that passed through its hands like smoke, faint, weightless, and somehow too expensive to resist. It raises uncomfortable questions. Why did the buyer remain anonymous? Why was the item described with such deliberate vagueness? And why was the Church so quick to let it go after trying so long to trap it? There's a theory not widely published, but whispered among certain bibliophiles, that the book was never meant to be possessed at all, that it moved where it needed to move, that each transaction was not ownership, but transfer. A ritual in disguise, a way to continue the book's breath. Because if the Book of Shadows does indeed exist, even in pieces, then every time it changes hands, something is renewed. Not the paper, not the words, but the memory of it, the echo. And Venice remembers. Not in titles or archives, but in the way its fog lingers longer on certain mornings. In the smell of ash that sometimes wafts from canals with no fire in sight. In the booksellers who, when asked about old volumes wrapped in cloth, just smile and say, "That one, it's already gone." In the damp corridors of a Jesuit seminary near Antwerp, there lived a man who spoke with mirrors. Father Thomas Albrecht, ordained in 1641, was no magician, no alchemist. He was by all formal accounts an exorcist, a sanctioned soldier of Christ, trained to wrest spirits from flesh with words, ritual, and relentless faith. But his methods were unconventional. In the sole surviving volume of his exorcism journals, now locked in a restricted archive in Bruges, he describes a series of possessions that resisted scripture, prayer, even force. These cases, he claimed, responded only to something else, something he called the reflected rite. The entry that matters most is dated March 3, 1654. In it, Albrecht recounts a visit to a manor outside Ghent, where a young girl had fallen into what appeared to be trance states. She did not scream, levitate, or contort. She read, constantly. Pages of air hands miming the turn of parchment that did not exist. She murmured syllables no one recognized, all while gazing into a mirror propped against the wall. It was the priest wrote as though she were being read. He attempted a standard exorcism. It failed. Holy water slid off her skin like rain on glass. So Albrecht tried something different. He brought a black-bound book, one he never describes, only refers to as the volume that cannot be named aloud. He set it in her lap, opened a mirror before her, and read not from the text, but from its reflection. The girl's trance deepened. Her murmurs grew clearer, and then she spoke in Latin, "It sees through you." Albrecht does not record what happened next, only that the session ended in silence. The girl was later moved to a convent, and the priest left the seminary the following year. What makes this entry extraordinary is not just its content, but how it mirrors, forgive the word, earlier whispers about the Book of Shadows. Reading it in reflection, a script that only emerges when reversed or when shown to someone else. In at least 4 other instances from inquisitorial records, suspects confessed to reading from a book while facing glass or polished metal. One spoke of a page that appeared only when I looked at myself. Another described the text as twin script legible only when doubled. There is precedent for this. Ancient scrying traditions used polished obsidian water bowls, even shieldbacks, as mediums. But the language here isn't about divination. It's about transference. About the text using the reader as a conduit and the mirror as a gate. Albrecht's later writings are stranger still. In marginal notes of his final sermon draft, we find the phrase, "The book does not teach, it remembers." And elsewhere, it cannot be burned because it never left smoke. These cryptic lines, ignored for centuries, now feel disturbingly familiar. In 1708, long after Albrecht's death, a letter from an anonymous Jesuit in Prague mentions a mirror book passed briefly through their library. The writer refused to name it directly, but claimed its ink bent light around the page, and that reading it required not the eyes, but the double of sight. He concluded with the words, "It does not read forward." That phrase appears again in 1882 in the diary of a Belgian occultist, who claimed to have found a fragment of a book that sang in reverse. He described a script that grew darker the longer he looked, and which eventually vanished into the mirror as if consumed by its own reflection. Whether fabrication or not, his sketch of the book's page matches others. We've seen the 7 rings, the absence of titles, and one faint symbol in the bottom margin, a closed eye. It's tempting to write all this off as obsession, pattern-seeking in coincidence, but the idea that the Book of Shadows operates through reflection, that it requires an image of the self to unlock its language, opens new, unsettling questions. Is it about knowledge or identity? Does the book reflect back what the reader brings to it? Or does it overwrite one trial from Venice includes a particularly eerie detail? The accused, a former monastic librarian, claimed the book knew when I looked at it with pride. He said its pages blurred when approached with certainty but clarified when read with doubt. It punished confidence. It rewarded surrender. The Inquisitor dismissed this as madness, but the phrasing lingers. The mirror as interface, the self as translation. The idea that this book, or whatever remains of it, demands not just attention, but vulnerability. That it's not read in the traditional sense, but performed, enacted, mirrored through the reader's own shifting self. Father Albrecht never returned to exorcism after that final case. He wrote nothing more of mirrors. But his final entry, barely legible, includes one sentence I saw myself reading, and I was not there. Perhaps the book isn't looking for believers. Perhaps it's looking for readers willing to disappear. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was the Church's sharpest tool after fire. Created in 1559 and maintained with grim diligence for nearly 4 centuries, it was less a list than a blacklist of souls. Philosophers, poets, scientists, mystics, their names marched through its pages like quiet funerals. Each title entered into the index bore the weight of condemnation and, for many, erasure. But what happens when a book never quite makes it in? It's easy to assume the Church burned what it feared. But in truth, the index didn't just destroy, it recorded. It tried to understand. To categorize, name, and lock down knowledge as tightly as it did heretics. The Inquisition was theological, yes, but it was also administrative. They didn't want chaos. They wanted control. And that's why it's so strange that no formal entry ever appears for the Book of Shadows. Not under that name. Not under any known synonym. Not even listed as a suspected codex, which the index sometimes did when titles were unclear. Yet if one digs not through the main entries, but the margins, the footnotes, the discarded drafts, an echo emerges. In a heavily redacted draft from the 1585 Venetian Index, a line is struck through in thick ink: Codex ignotus qui umbras docet. The unknown codex which teaches shadows. There's no further description, no author, just that phrase slashed as if its inclusion was already too much. The scribe's notes include a brief apology, term deemed unstable, source unclear, recommend omission, unstable. That's a curious word choice for a manuscript. Not incorrect, not heretical, unstable. Some researchers believe that this particular phrase refers to a group of books, not just one. The argument goes that several banned texts may have shared thematic structures, Gnostic frameworks, inverted liturgical patterns, or esoteric geometries, and the Church lumped them together under a conceptual umbrella. But the wording teaches shadows feels specific. A book that doesn't just contain heresy, but instructs it, guides it. More telling still is the case of the Liber Primus Lucis, a manuscript condemned in the Spanish Index of 1611. The official description lists it as an inversion of Genesis devoid of attribution. But in a letter attached to its file, a cardinal writes, "This is not the first book of light. it is the second of shadow. The implication is clear: the Codex had a sibling, one already known, already feared, but never formally named. Even stranger is how frequently certain entries in the index appear to be placeholders. There are repeated listings for unnamed volumes possessing characteristics of delirium or texts referred to by the accused, but of which no physical copy was found. These phantom books haunt the registry like uninvited guests, and in several cases, trial testimonies include attempts to draw symbols from memory, usually spirals, mirrored letters, or sevenfold diagrams. The censors sometimes included these sketches in the margins, sometimes burned them, but enough remained to form a pattern. One chilling detail surfaces in the 1640 Roman Index draft, where a censor's handwritten annotation beside an untitled entry reads, "No fire, no ash, pages not compliant to what gravity doctrine destruction." There's also the mystery of item 347, a now-lost page from the 1712 revision of the Index. In the table of contents, it's listed. In the final publication, it's gone. We know it once existed because a French historian, André Vallon, made a transcript before its disappearance. According to Vallon, the entry was brief, written in Latin and Greek, and included the phrase per speculum in umbra, through a mirror in shadow. The line comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, often interpreted as a reflection on the limits of human understanding. But its presence here in a list of forbidden books implies someone saw a mirror not as metaphor but as mechanism. Vallon's notes suggest that item 347 may have referred not to a specific text, but to a method, a way of reading that the Church found inherently dangerous. Reading backwards, reading mirrored, reading inward. The Book of Shadows, then, may not have been a singular volume, but a technique masquerading as one. Why omit such an entry? Why remove all trace? The likeliest answer: fear of replication. Most forbidden books were known. You could name them, ban them, debate them. But this was a concept with teeth. A text that taught secrecy responded to observation, possibly altered its contents based on the reader's intent. How do you classify something that shifts every time it's touched? It's worth noting that multiple editions of the Index refer vaguely to mirror doctrines and reflection heresies. These phrases are never clarified, but in each instance the listed punishment is the same: death without trial, immediate, absolute. That kind of sentence isn't handed out lightly. It suggests that whatever they feared couldn't be argued with, only silenced, and even then, perhaps not. One final detail in the 1780 edition, the last before the Index began its long decline, a censor adds a curious flourish beside a redacted title, a single ink-drawn I, closed. Not crossed out, not scratched, closed, like something watching, now resting. There are no accidents in Vatican print records. Every indulgence, every papal bull, every sanctioned treatise was logged, numbered, stamped. The machinery of church authority ran on the ink of certainty. If a page bore the seal of Rome, it existed. If not, it did not. Or at least it wasn't supposed to. And yet deep in the Vatican's typographic archives lies a record that should not exist. Dated 1613, it lists a commission order for a book titled Umbrae Dei, the Shadows of God. The printer of record is one Giacomo Belladonna, a respected artisan responsible for multiple official publications under Pope Paul V. His register entry shows the full breakdown pages, ordered parchment, prepared ink, delivered. Payment received in full. But no copy survives. None in the Vatican library. None in the restricted stacks. None in the back rooms where whispered texts are locked away in metal sleeves. The entry's note column contains a single sharp correction: fulfillment recalled, destroyed. Then beneath that, added in a different hand, refused to burn. The printing that never happened, apparently, happened. But the book did not cooperate. Scholars reviewing Belladonna's records found additional oddities. The order for Umbre Dei included a rare ink formula not used in any other church publication, a mixture containing soot resin and a trace mineral found primarily in Syrian deposits. The parchment stock was not lambskin, as was standard, but a darker treated material typically reserved for maps designed to withstand moisture and fire. Why such durable components for a theological manuscript? More compelling is the contract itself. Belladonna typically kept his commissions clean and consistent: title, author, date, quantity. This one, however, is missing a name. No author is listed. The title is bracketed as if tentative, and the language listed for typesetting is simply variable. That word doesn't belong in a printer's log. Type must be fixed. Language must be known. But here the very instructions seem to shift. A letter from Belladonna to his cousin, preserved in private hands until the 1980s, offers a cryptic account. I completed the pages, he writes. But the words would not hold. He describes the ink sliding from the press and certain letters disappearing overnight. He mentions working at night by candlelight, only as if the sun itself made the book shy. In one line barely legible, he adds, "It knew I was afraid." The strangest detail. After the book was completed, however briefly, Belladonna requested a confessor. He never explained why. He lived 5 more years but never printed another theological work. His notes suggest he dismantled the plates himself and buried the frames in a vineyard he owned outside Orvieto. Soil samples taken from that site in 1991 revealed high concentrations of carbonized metal fragments. Nothing definitive, but odd. Some historians dismiss this as printer's superstition, the residue of handling controversial material during a time of religious paranoia. But others see a pattern. The order for Umbre Dei corresponds closely to the timeline of other disappearances: a lost folio from Spain, a burned codex in Mainz, a missing Jesuit dispatch from Prague, all within 3 years of Belladonna's commission, all referencing shadows, all lost to fire that left no ash. We are left to imagine what Umbre Dei contained. Was it an edition of the Book of Shadows, a partial transcription, a Vatican-sanctioned attempt to contain the manuscript through print? If so, it would be the ultimate irony, Rome trying to absorb the thing it spent centuries hunting. Perhaps the plan was containment through legitimacy, to fix the text in place, to pin it like a moth between pages stripped of its rituals, its silence, its breath. But some books are not meant to be printed, and some presses, when forced to speak what should remain whisper, go silent forever. Belladonna's press was eventually sold, its tools scattered. One of his plates, never attributed to a known book, now sits in a museum in Bologna. It bears no legible words, only concentric curves etched faintly into brass. But when light strikes it at a particular angle, a shadow forms a ring of eyes closed, and at its center, a mark scholars still debate. Some call it a stylized flame, others a breath drawn in ink. A few insist it's just a scratch, nothing more. But when seen through a mirror, the shape resembles a book, not printed, not bound, only waiting. To the church, a book was a vessel, a body. The covers were its skin, the pages its flesh, the words its spirit. But what if some books took that metaphor literally? What if their bindings were not simply for protection, but for ritual? What if the very act of touching them was an initiation? Throughout the late medieval period, there are scattered mentions of books bound not in leather but in other things: human hair, animal sinew, woven linen soaked in blood. One Flemish chronicle from 1468 refers to a volume in the possession of the widow mother, wrapped in infant's cloth bound with bone. Another from rural Hungary speaks of a prayer book whose cover whispered when damp. Most scholars assume exaggeration folklore dressed up as fear. But sometimes fear tells the truth sideways. Enter the phenomenon of talismanic bindings, books designed not merely to preserve content, but to enact it, to protect the reader. Or more unnervingly, to protect others from the reader. A surviving example exists in the Rosenbach collection in Philadelphia. A grimoire dated circa 1600 bound in braided iron thread and wrapped in pale velvet. It contains spells for protection against dreams, but the binding itself is what draws attention. When exposed to low light, the metal weaves form 7 interlocking circles nearly identical to the markings we've seen in earlier fragments, connected to the Book of Shadows. No other book in the collection carries such a motif, nor does any contemporary grimoire explain its purpose. A less studied volume kept quietly in the archives of a Carthusian monastery in Sicily contains a different kind of warning. The outer leather is scorched, but not burned. Instead, the edges curl inward unnaturally, as though pulled by heat from within. The inner lining has been embedded with shards of mirror glass, barely visible, placed there not for ornament, but intention. A small Latin inscription near the spine reads, "Only those who bleed light may read." That phrase appears again, faintly scratched into the corner of a burned codex retrieved from the ruins of a fire in Strasbourg in 1731. The book was unmarked by title, but the fragments suggest a mix of Hebrew letters, reversed Latin, and pictograms consistent with other texts rumored to be pieces of the Shadow Book. Once again, 7 circles, and again, mirror fragments embedded in the cover, this time arranged to form what looks like a closed eye. You begin to see a pattern. These bindings were not decorative. They were functional, protective, sometimes reactive. There are accounts of pages that would not open unless warmed by breath or touched with fingertips, still damp with holy water. Some bindings included metals known for conductivity, copper threads, silver inlays, even minute traces of magnetite. One theory proposes that these elements were not symbolic, but literal part of an attempt to render the book responsive, alive in some electrochemical sense. A kind of early machine, but spiritual. We find echoes of this thinking in Jewish mezuzahs, in Islamic calligraphy, worn as amulets in Tibetan prayer wheels that spin mantras into wind. But here the intention feels darker, or at least more private. These books were not worn to ward off evil. They were concealed, passed in silence, made to be handled only by the initiated. One 17th century manual on bookbinding from Mainz contains an unusual caution. Use no flesh linen for grimoires that breathe. Flesh linen, the phrase is archaic, but scholars believe it refers to cloth woven from fibers steeped in blood. A binding that doesn't just encase but binds actively, holds something in, or something out. In 1999, a restoration lab in Geneva accidentally activated a hidden clasp mechanism inside a 16th century devotional book. The clasp revealed a hollow compartment barely large enough for a single slip of vellum. Inside was a tightly folded page bearing only one symbol, a spiral with a flame at its center. The ink had no pigment. Under infrared, it became clear it was written in saliva. Some believe this was a signature. Others believe it was part of a ritual. Either way, the physicality of the object, the breath, the blood, the mirror, the clasp, turns the book into more than a container. It becomes an interface. And that brings us inevitably back to the Book of Shadows. No confirmed copy exists, but every alleged fragment described shares one thing in common, an unusual cover. Often soft, sometimes warm, always silent. Some were said to vibrate. Others seemed to darken when approached. A French antiquarian in 1874 described handling a folio bound in dusk, though no material matched that description. He said it left his fingers smelling of cloves and myrrh, again the scent. Always the scent. The coated covers go further still. Geometries carved into the bindings. Thread patterns that mirror ancient symbols. Braided knots whose loops correspond to phrases in Gnostic texts or Cathar psalms. One particular configuration of loops, the so-called seventh braid, appears in manuscripts across France, Bohemia, and Portugal, always in books no one dares open completely. The Church, of course, condemned such bindings as theatrical nonsense, but they collected them nonetheless, locked them away, tagged them with numbers instead of titles. One Vatican ledger refers to an object presumed textual, sealed in triplicate, to be handled only by gloved theologians. Its entry is dated 1756. The book has never resurfaced. It's possible these were just protective measures. Old superstition, aesthetics taken too far. Or perhaps these bindings weren't to protect the book from the reader. They were to protect the reader from the book. Portugal, 1808. The air thick with revolt. Napoleon's armies had pushed into Iberia, and in the chaos, the old grip of the church began to loosen. Archives were ransacked. Monasteries overrun. In the countryside, the Inquisition weakened, scattered, and increasingly irrelevant, struggled to maintain its centuries-old dominion. But while the French took gold and grain, rebels took something far stranger: books. Not just any books, not Bibles or histories or ledgers, but hidden volumes with no names. Texts that didn't belong. Among the many rebellions of this period, one stands out. A small, short-lived uprising in the village of Idanha Avelha. What drew attention wasn't the violence, though there was blood, but what was discovered in the wake of it. Inside the ruins of a monastery cellar, soldiers found a fire pit that had been prepared but never lit. Inside, wrapped in layers of waxed cloth, lay 4 books. 3 bore familiar markings: Cathar writings, apocryphal gospels, a battered copy of the Zohar. But the 4th had no title, no author. Its pages reportedly smelled of vinegar and incense. The ink had faded almost to invisibility, but under heat, faint symbols reappeared: circles, reversed letters, glyphs with no alphabet. The manuscript was confiscated. Its chain of custody vanishes after a few weeks. But a French officer, writing privately to his sister, described what he'd seen. It was a book of wind, he wrote, pages so light, they moved before your breath. But I could not read it. The priest with us did, and he wept. The priest was never named. The book was never officially logged. A few years later, in 1814, a Carmelite friar named Manuel de Velasco wrote a peculiar letter to the Bishop of Coimbra. In it, he warned of texts from the hills carried by barefoot monks, unreadable by daylight, chanted before mirrors. He referred to these volumes as sombras vivas, living shadows, and claimed they were part of the secret rebellion within the rebellion. He believed certain rebel priests were smuggling fragments of the Book of Shadows, not for destruction, but preservation. Velasco wasn't a madman. He was educated, politically cautious, and had previously denounced French influence on ecclesiastical order. That he would suddenly write of mystical books and mirror chants is jarring, but his account aligns with earlier reports of fragments resurfacing, not whole books, of monks operating beneath ecclesiastical radar, of texts shared only at night with no ink visible by candlelight until a mirror was introduced. Further support comes from a forgotten ledger in the Coimbra Seminary. One entry buried beneath mundane purchases of salt and fabric records payment to courier parchment from Portalegre, eyes averted. that's all. 3 words that imply the courier was not to look at what he carried, which only makes sense if someone feared even the act of seeing the object. The rebellion in Portugal faded, as most do. The French retreated. The church, bruised, but intact, reasserted itself. But in certain mountain communities, oral traditions began to shift. Folk songs emerged, low, humming chants passed through generations without words. A linguist cataloging them in the early 20th century noted their unusual structures, 7-tone scales, open-ended refrains, and lyrics that, when translated, made little sense. The mirror opens when breath is held, ash reads the eye, folded in fire, the page sings again. Coincidence, folklore, maybe. But one of these villages, Monsanto, houses a chapel carved entirely from stone where a small shelf is cut into the wall. Locals call it O altar sem nome, the altar with no name. They place candles there, not icons. When asked why, a resident once said, "Because the book is gone." But the breath is still here. Researchers have visited. Some claim to have found nothing. Others report a faint trace of scent again, that blend of burned oil and myrrh. One linguist recorded soft whispers when alone in the chapel, not voices but patterns. When he played the recording backwards, a low phrase emerged, barely audible: "Do not look. Only mirror." Perhaps it was a trick. Audio pareidolia. Perhaps all of this is accumulation superstition, layered onto silence until the silence begins to speak. But one detail is harder to explain. A French officer wounded during the Peninsular Campaign and held in a remote convent near the Spanish border wrote in his journal of a nun who visited him during his fever. She never spoke. She held a mirror, and at night he claimed she read from a book with no words. He said he heard nothing, only that when she read, I knew things I had not lived. I remembered what had not happened. The entry ends simply, "She turned the page, and my dream changed." And perhaps that's what this book was, not just a manuscript, but a technology of memory. One that hid among the rebels, moved between cloisters, breathed through ritual and revolution alike. Something protected, not because it could win a war, but because it could rewrite one. The Iberian rebellions may have failed politically, but beneath the smoke and gunfire, something else survived. A whisper, a page, a breath held and passed on. It's one thing for a book to be feared. It's another for it to be familiar in fragments to enemies who never met. And yet that is what the Book of Shadows appears to be, a palimpsest of heresies layered by traditions that never should have touched. Gnostics, Kabbalists, and Cathars, each branded a threat in their time, each extinguished with holy flame, and yet in their ashes the same shapes rise, the same metaphors, the same sevenfold symbols, and always the sense that truth lay not in what could be seen, but in what lay behind it. The Gnostics believed in hidden knowledge, not metaphorically, but tangibly, a secret architecture of the cosmos lost in the fall, waiting to be recovered by the awakened few. Their Gospels are filled with phrases that read like riddles: that which is seen was made by that which is not. The silence speaks, and again the theme of reversal salvation, through inversion, understanding, through unknowing. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus does not teach plainly. He speaks in layers. He offers seeds. The Book of Shadows, if it exists, behaves the same way. Then there are the Kabbalists, Jewish mystics, who saw the universe as a language, each letter a key, each number a door. In their teachings, hidden codes called Notarikon and Tamura rearranged scripture into new meanings. The Zohar describes reading as a form of return, a journey through mirrors, divine names, and flaming wheels. In one passage, It describes a book which writes itself in the air and cannot be touched by hand. A poetic image, but perhaps also a hint. And the Cathars, dualist Christians hunted to extinction who believed the world itself was the devil's lie, and that true salvation meant remembering the light beyond matter. They spoke of the Book of Love, a lost text said to contain the prayers of angels and the true name of the soul before birth. In one rare confession, a dying Cathar described reading a page that showed her the world behind this one folded like a hand behind cloth. When asked who wrote it, she answered, "No one. It is what remains after words die." Modern historians treat these parallels with caution. Syncretism. The blending of traditions was common. Borders were porous and ideas leaked across them like water through old stone. But the detail here feels more pointed than coincidence. When multiple traditions describe the same structure, books that write themselves, texts that mirror pages that change the reader, we must wonder, were they imagining the same impossibility or witnessing the same phenomenon? A manuscript discovered in Toledo in 1923 contains annotations in Latin, Hebrew, and Occitan. The main text is a mathematical treatise, but in the margins are drawings, spirals, 7-petaled flowers, mirrored words. A single phrase written in 3 alphabets recurs: fold to see. Fold what? The page. The mind. It mirrors a practice found in esoteric Kabbalah, the Ilana de Kidin, or Tree of Secrets, where sacred diagrams must be folded in specific ways to reveal hidden paths. Not metaphorically, physically. The paper must be handled to make the meaning visible. And in Gnostic, thought the soul's path to the pleroma, the full light requires passing through veils. Each one peeled back by insight, not doctrine. A page that folds, a veil, a breath, a mirror. The images recur like refrains. Even the numbers align. The Book of Shadows is often linked to 7 rings, 7 folds, 7 eyes. Gnostic cosmology speaks of 7 heavens. Kabbalah maps 10 sephirot, but the hidden unreachable one, Da'at, is often not counted, leaving 7. The Cathars believed in 7 stages of purification. The idea of completeness through 7s is not rare. But in the Book of Shadows, it isn't symbolic. It seems structural. A letter from a 17th-century mystic in Amsterdam, likely a Marrano Kabbalist, mentions a text with 7 bindings, each made of different cloth. He claimed that reading it required unwrapping each layer while reciting specific names. He called it the Book of Hidden Unwrapping. The Church called it blasphemy. But his description is eerily familiar, a book that unfolds you, not the other way around. So what are we to make of this convergence? Did the Book of Shadows borrow from each tradition? Was it built like a cathedral of forbidden thought, stone by stone, rite by rite, or was it older, the source from which each of these drew the silent template beneath their dreams? It's impossible to say. But the persistence of certain motifs, folds, mirrors, breath 7 suggests more than metaphor. It suggests technology. Not wires or machines, but ritual frameworks, mental architectures that rewire the reader simply through contact, which may explain why the Church never listed it, why it was hunted but never catalogued. Because how do you ban a book that writes itself differently each time? How do you condemn a mirror that doesn't reflect light but soul? Perhaps the Gnostics glimpsed one side, the Kabbalists another, the Cathars a third. And somewhere in the intersections between them, the overlaps, the book waited, not to be believed in, not even to be read, just to be found. In 1510, Albrecht Dürer created a woodcut that still puzzles art historians. It is not one of his famous self-portraits, nor one of his biblical studies. It's smaller, unsigned, and often dismissed as apocryphal. but to a particular kind of eye, the kind that has followed the trace of the Book of Shadows across centuries, this engraving is something else entirely. A map, or perhaps a confession. The engraving depicts a robed figure kneeling before a mirror. Behind them, a large book floats unbound, its pages fanned in an unnatural arc, as if suspended in wind or breath. On the ground, 7 concentric circles ripple outward from the mirror's base, etched so faintly they vanish unless viewed at a tilt. The figure's face is obscured not by shadow, but by flame. And carved delicately along the bottom edge in a script nearly lost to time are the words, Umbrae cadunt intra oculum. The shadows fall within the eye. At first glance, it seems like one of many allegorical prints from the era, perhaps a meditation on knowledge or inner vision. But none of Dürer's other works display these symbols. The circles, the mirror, the breath pages, and that Latin phrase nowhere else in his corpus. Some art historians argue the engraving is a forgery, but if so, it is a masterful one composed with tools and techniques consistent with Dürer's hand. Others admit it may be real, but have no explanation for its content. But there is another document, a letter penned by Dürer's pupil, Hans Baldung Grien, in which he references a lost page from his master's sketchbook. The drawing, he says, was burned before publication, for it was not made with the usual sight. He cryptically describes it as a vision drawn by dreamlight after contact with the Spanish fragment. What fragment, no one knows. But Baldung goes on to say, the book was not opened. It opened, and Master wept. Strangely, in the same period, Dürer began painting eyes, large, solitary eyes surrounded by strange sigils and non-Christian symbols. In one marginal sketch, he drew an eye within a spiral, the same 7-circle motif we've seen etched in margins, scratched onto covers and whispered in chants. It appears again faintly in the background of his 1514 Melancholia Wiener print, so densely layered with numerology and esoteric meaning that it continues to fuel academic debate to this day. A few radical scholars suggest that Dürer may have encountered a fragment of the Book of Shadows, not in a library, but in a patron's home. Nuremberg at the time was a hub for humanist thinkers, Protestant dissenters, and underground Kabbalistic circles. It's possible that someone gave him access to a page, a drawing, even just a whisper of the book. Whatever it was, it affected him. His style changed. His margins darkened. His final years grew quieter. The engraving in question, now known unofficially as the Eye of Silence, surfaced in a Bavarian collection in 1839 and has since passed between private hands. It is rarely shown publicly. Some say it carries a curse, though that's more gossip than gospel. Still, a few curious details remain. The paper it was printed on bears no watermark. The ink under infrared scan contains trace elements of silver, and behind the figure in the image just above their shoulder, there is a barely visible sigil scratched into the background. It's not one of Dürer's usual marks. It matches no known language. But it does match a carving found in a stone chapel in Montségur, and a burnt etching from a Venetian private auction, and the clasp of the book confiscated in the Iberian Rebellion. When overlaid, these marks align not perfectly, but deliberately. Each one adds a piece to the whole, like a jigsaw that spans continents and centuries, designed not to be assembled by one person, but by a lineage, a conspiracy of readers. Theories abound. Some claim Dürer encoded more clues in his other prints, that Melancholia Wine itself is a map, the magic square a cipher, that the tools in the image, the hourglass, the scales, the polyhedron, represent the construction of a different kind of book, one that builds itself through geometry, breath, and dream. A few even claim that the engraving, when viewed in reflection and illuminated by flickering light, reveals a second image, a face in the shadows of the mirror watching. But perhaps this is all interpretation, the natural human desire to find meaning in patterns, to make the shadows speak. Or perhaps Dürer really did see something. Not the whole book, maybe, but a piece, a page, a flicker. And like the scribes before him, he could not keep it to himself. He did what any artist would do. He passed it on, in code, in craft, in silence. So if you ever stand before the eye of silence, do so gently. Let your eyes rest. Let the light shift. And listen not to what you see, but to what seems to wait, just behind the mirror. It has no name you can file, no title you can write in a ledger, but it has a smell. That above all is what keeps returning. The smoke. Not the smell of burning, not wood or ash, but something older, oilier, stranger. Myrrh, vinegar, iron, ink left too long in heat. A breath before combustion. Inquisitor Giovanni della Torre, stationed in Florence in 1603, wrote a private note after interrogating a monk accused of harboring forbidden texts. The note was not part of the official transcript. It was scrawled into the back of a prayer book, like a confession to himself. I smelled it again. That same scent, like charred sanctity. He never names what it is. But 2 decades earlier, another inquisitor in Avignon, unrelated, unaware, had written nearly the same phrase. The room held the scent long after the book was gone. The sisters called it the breath of fire. By now you recognize the trail. The Book of Shadows, or whatever remains of it, doesn't just leave behind fragments, drawings, and rumors. It leaves scent. Something olfactory. Something primal. Something that survives even when the pages don't. In 1972, while renovating a former Carmelite convent in southern France, workers discovered a false wall behind the old sacristy. Inside, buried in a hollow niche, was the shredded cover of what had once been a book. No text, no pages. Just the binding, dark, brittle, wrapped in burned cloth. The cloth was sealed with wax, but when cut open, it released a scent that halted the entire crew. An archivist brought in to examine it later described the smell as the air in a room after someone leaves, but more ancient. Like smoke that never ignited. The cloth was archived. The scent, however, lingered for days. Skeptics argue that the odor came from preservation oils or mold, but multiple independent labs failed to isolate a source. No fungus, no rot, no chemical residue. One technician said, "It smelled like something that had been burned without fire." This isn't a singular event. Across archives and private collections, there are documented cases, often footnoted, often dismissed, of books that carry a scent no one can quite place. One volume in Krakow emits a faint metallic tang when handled. Another in Zurich smells sweet when closed and bitter when opened. All are fragmentary. All are uncatalogued. All seem to share a lineage too subtle for indexes, but too exact for coincidence. Perhaps the strangest account comes from the Vatican's own archivist, a man who has requested anonymity even decades after his retirement. In a whispered interview, he claimed to have once handled a box marked non consultare. Inside was a manuscript wrapped in blackened vellum. It had no writing on its cover, no seal. He opened it, just briefly. There were no words on the first page, he said. Only soot patterns, like smoke had passed over it while the page was wet. He described a sensation of warmth not from the page but in his chest, as if he'd remembered something he had never lived. And then came the scent, not strong, not unpleasant, but it stayed. On my hands, my shirt, in my mouth, for days. When asked to describe it, he paused. Then, if silence had breath, that. It is difficult to study scent historically. You cannot catalog what cannot be preserved. But anecdotal traces remain enough to suggest that whatever this book is, it travels not just through paper and symbol, but through the air itself, that it imprints, that it lingers. This idea appears in a Portuguese exorcism manual from 1689, where the priest warns that some cursed texts exhale the memory of their last reader. He advises not only burning such books, but sealing the ashes in vinegar and burying them in running water. The reason because they rise again by scent. There's poetry in that. Madness, too. But maybe not just madness. In 2014, a private collector in Belgium reported a phantom odor emanating from a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a single object, a binding with no text wrapped in charred linen. The linen bore an impression, a spiral pressed into the fabric, as though burned but without scorching. The collector's housekeeper refused to clean the room, said the scent gave her slow dreams. Even digital scans of such fragments sometimes carry annotations from handlers. Smells unusual, faint but persistent. Return to gloves even after washing. These aren't scientific measurements, but they are patterns, and patterns even in the absence of proof form maps. What if this book is not simply elusive but reactive? What if it remembers not in words or image but in atmosphere, in air, in scent? We speak of the smell of old books as if it were nostalgia, but what if that smell isn't just age? What if it's residue echo trace? What if the book of shadows scattered hidden burned lives not in pages but in breath? And what if the scent is its way of saying, I was here. I was read. I remember you. Florence, 1928. A city soaked in beauty, heavy with memory. Among its scholars was a man named Dr. Emilio Vescovi, a paleographer polyglot and quietly obsessive collector of ancient fragments. He wasn't famous, but he was respected. The kind of man who mended crumbling pages with the care of a surgeon and read dead languages like lullabies. He was also the last person known to have held what may have been the most complete surviving fragment of the Book of Shadows. The document came into his possession anonymously, a parcel delivered to his apartment, with no return address. Inside a single folio folded once wrapped in faded cloth. No note, no demand. Only a whisper of scent and ink that seemed to shimmer when struck by dusk light. Vescovi documented his analysis in meticulous detail. His first notes describe a strange tactile resistance when unfolding the page as if the material resisted handling. He identified the parchment as pre-14th century, likely Iberian, but with elements more typical of Syrian vellum. The ink at first glance was illegible, an apparent cipher, possibly a devotional gloss. But under a magnifying lens, Vescovi noticed something that changed everything. The letters moved, not literally, not in the dramatic sense, but they realigned subtly depending on the angle of observation. Certain glyphs disappeared entirely when viewed head-on, only reappearing in peripheral vision. He wrote, "The page reads better when I do not look directly, like it prefers to be overheard." He transcribed 2 paragraphs, or what he believed to be paragraphs. The language was unfamiliar, yet not entirely alien. He recognized fragments from Gnostic Greek stray Kabbalistic structures and a form of Latin so corrupted it resembled prayer more than prose. He translated a single phrase repeated across both stanzas, fold the breath. Remember backwards. No syntax, just imperative suggestion. After 3 days, his writing changes. In the margins of his journal, his tone grows unsure. He complains of disorientation, not sleep deprivation, memory displacement. He writes, "I remember events I cannot place, people I do not know." He refers to dreams that seem to continue from one night to the next, always in the same room, always reading a book that won't stay still. On the fifth day, the last line in his journal is scrawled diagonally across the page. It is not a book. It is a mirror turned inward. He was never seen again. His apartment showed no sign of struggle, nothing stolen, no evidence of flight. The folio was gone. Only his notes remained, along with his gloves laid neatly beside an unlit candle. The case was never formally investigated. Friends assumed suicide or quiet disappearance. Italy was on the cusp of upheaval. People vanished all the time. But what unsettled those closest to him were the dreams. Over the following weeks, 2 colleagues claimed to see Vescovi in sleep. One described him sitting in a library, lit only by moonlight, copying a book onto glass. The other claimed he stood behind a veil, silently mouthing words, but no sound emerged. Both awoke with the smell of myrrh clinging to their pillows. Years later, a rare book dealer in Turin received an inquiry from a man claiming to be Vescovi, or someone using his name. The request was simple. "Do you possess any volumes that cannot be indexed?" the dealer, intrigued, replied. But no answer came, and the postmark on the envelope smudged. No city, no country, just the faint outline of a spiral. Skeptics argue that Vescovi's disappearance was unrelated to any text, that mental illness, stress, or romantic crisis caused him to vanish. And yet his name continues to surface in the margins of other stories. Annotations in forgotten catalogs, initials carved into a monastery wall, even once a line attributed to E.V. found in the back of a grimoire in Prague. I am not the reader. I am the breath between the pages. And so the Book of Shadows claims another echo. Not a martyr, not a believer, a scholar, a man who asked questions and perhaps was answered too clearly. It is said that knowledge demands sacrifice, but some knowledge collects. At first it seemed like nothing more than a doodle, a small spiral of rings scratched into the back corner of a dusty psalter in Cologne. 7 circles, concentric and precise, etched so faintly they vanished under certain light. The archivist nearly missed it, but something in its repetition, in its refusal to fade, pulled her attention. This symbol wasn't decoration, it was code, and it was everywhere. The sigil of 7 circles has surfaced in places that officially have nothing to do with one another. Etched into the wooden desk of a 17th-century scribe in Toledo, painted discreetly into the corner of an altarpiece in a monastery outside Lisbon, sewn into the lining of a nun's habit held in a Bavarian museum. Each time 7 rings equidistant, with the faintest distortion, in the outermost one a break, a curve, an opening. Scholars initially dismissed it as a folk motif, a common shape found in textiles, architecture, or ritual art. But deeper study revealed something else. The sigil only ever appeared in contexts tied to censorship, heresy, or forbidden knowledge. Not once has it been found in a sanctioned manuscript. Not once has it appeared in a work listed in the official Vatican registry. And yet it recurs over and over in trial records, marginalia, graffiti behind choir stalls, always in the background, always as if someone was quietly leaving a mark. A particularly striking example emerged in the ruins of a burnt abbey near Girona. On a stone wall blackened with soot, a single image had survived the fire, the sigil carved just above eye level. Beneath it, faint words in Latin, non liber sed verbum. Not a book, but a word. That phrasing is strange, and it echoes something we've heard before. In Sister Benedetta's dying confession, in the margins of forbidden fragments, in the whispered testimonies of accused witches. The idea that the Book of Shadows isn't a book at all, not in the way we understand books. It's a message, a frequency, a ritual encoded across space and time. And the sigil may be the key to finding it. One of the most compelling clues came from a strange little chapel in Moravia, where a set of 7 stone circles were embedded into the floor in an unusual pattern. They weren't part of the original design. Radiocarbon analysis suggests they were added centuries later. Each circle aligns with a window in the chapel, and during the spring, equinox light passes through them in sequence, forming a brief cascade of illumination on the altar. A visiting scholar who witnessed it claimed to hear a low hum when the final circle lit up. He later described the experience as standing inside a thought that wasn't mine. Of course, there are other explanations. Architectural resonance, wind in stone. But what if the circles, whether carved, drawn, or illuminated, weren't just symbols? What if they were instruments? In occult traditions, circles are protection, conduits, gates. But 7, that number reappears like a drumbeat in this story. 7 bindings, 7 folds, 7 whispered names, 7 layers of memory according to certain Gnostic rites. In Kabbalistic thought, 7 is the number of descent, the steps through which divine energy enters the world. To some Cathars, 7 was the number of worlds the soul must pass through to be free. So what happens when you draw 7 circles together? In a 15th century grimoire found in a private Czech collection, its authenticity still debated, a diagram labeled Sigillum Umbrarum shows 7 circles nested with runic markings around the edge. The annotation reads, "When each is opened, the voice begins." Another page in the same volume lists instructions for a ritual using 7 mirrors and a folded page that bleeds. Most copies omit this part. The one that kept it smelled faintly of iron. And then there's the case of the boy in Palermo. In 1864, a child was found in the cathedral scribbling the same 7-circle symbol in ash across a floor tile. He'd never been taught to draw it. No one knew where he'd seen it. When asked what it meant, he simply said, "It shows where the book breathes." The priest who recorded the incident later claimed the boy spoke in reversed syllables, and that his eyes did not blink as he spoke. The drawing was scrubbed clean. The child was moved to a cloister, but the tile it cracked 2 weeks later, a clean circular break in the exact center. Coincidence, of course, unless it isn't. What if this sigil is not a decoration, but a locator, a kind of spiritual geotag? A symbol left behind by those who encountered the book, not to explain, but to mark, to warn, or maybe to invite. Because symbols don't survive by accident. They are chosen, passed, buried, redrawn. And this one has lasted longer than it should in too many places, in too many forms to be dismissed. 7 circles, 1 breath. A page that turns even when no one is watching. There are places in the Vatican that even most cardinals have never seen. Not hidden exactly, but sealed by ritual regulation and the weight of centuries. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, is vast, stretching beneath the city-state, like the roots of a tree fed by forgotten truths. Millions of documents, some unopened in centuries, lie in silence. But among the few who've stepped past the final doors, a rumor flickers like a candle in wind that somewhere in those halls exists a book that is not asleep. A book that listens. In 1999, a whistleblower, a cleric turned archivist who later disappeared from public life, described a sealed vault within the archive labeled Vox Sola, the only voice. He claimed it held just one object, a manuscript so sensitive it could only be handled under dim red light in silence and by gloved hands washed in vinegar. Not to preserve the book, but to preserve the handler. He called it a living page, not metaphor, literal. A book, he said, that changed with presence. When asked what was inside, he refused to answer. He only repeated a phrase, "It knows when you know." Another former Vatican conservator in an off-record interview in 2011 described a document she handled briefly, a bound volume stored under lead casing in a humidity-sealed drawer. She was asked only to log the condition of the binding, but when she opened the case, she felt warmth. Not from the book, but from the air itself, as if someone had just stood there. The pages made no sound when turned. She described them as not quite there. No text, just dark impressions, as if the ink had sunk inward out of sight. A third account, this one even more bizarre, comes from an external scholar granted partial access to the archives in the late 1980s. He reported finding a codex with no title page written in multiple hands, some ancient, some seemingly modern, all in languages that should not coexist. His notes describe one page where the letters vanished as he read them. He thought it was an optical illusion until his assistant standing behind him said, "There are no letters on that page." When he looked again, it was blank. He never saw the book again. It was gone by the next day. He was told he had misfiled his request. His logbook entry was crossed out in red ink. The assistant who had accompanied him died a few months later of unexplained cardiac arrest. His final email sent to a colleague read, "I still see the margins. These are stories, whispers, but they align across decades, countries, ranks. The idea that within the most sacred archive in Christendom lies something so unstable, so reactive, that it cannot be described in conventional terms. A document not just preserved, but contained. A manuscript not read, but encountered. It's not only modern accounts. A 17th century Jesuit inventory references a Liber Unius Obscurissimus, or Book of Greatest Obscurity, stored in a chamber beneath the Chamber of Keys. The note includes a strange warning, "Do not open alone." It does not favor silence. Another line, almost unreadable from smudging, appears to say, "It whispers to glass." That phrasing reappears in a separate record from 1746, where an unnamed archivist notes an item that cannot be photographed, reflected, or copied, for it changes what surrounds it when preserved too long. It was stored for less than a year before being moved to a sealed chamber. The record ends abruptly. The archivist never logged another entry. You might wonder why such a document, if it exists, would be kept at all. Why not destroy it? Burn it? But the Church doesn't always destroy heresies. Sometimes it keeps them close-chained in dark rooms where only certain eyes may glance. Control is not always destruction. It is containment. There is, however, a lingering possibility that this so-called living book is not singular, that it is part of a tradition, or perhaps even a type of text born not from ink and vellum, but from ritual. That it responds because it was made to respond. Because if the Book of Shadows truly exists, it may not simply be a book with dangerous ideas. It may be a mechanism, a device tuned to consciousness, to proximity, to belief. And what better place to store such a relic than beneath the weight of St. Peter's dome, surrounded by marble saints and iron keys who would dare reach for it there? Then again, maybe it's not stored at all. Maybe it's just sleeping, waiting, listening through the walls. It surfaced in Paris, tucked between loose pages in a battered Latin grammar book. The folio had no cover, no title, no markings, just a single sheet folded once and brittle at the seams. But the ink hadn't faded. The lines were tight serpentine, barely legible without magnification. A student at the Sorbonne found it in 2016 during a library audit. She thought it was someone's old notes until she tried to read them aloud and found she couldn't. Her voice caught. Her mouth formed the shapes, but no sound emerged. Then the dreams began. She wasn't alone. The folio now referred to in underground academic circles as Fragment 47 became the subject of unofficial study. A handful of scholars and students passed it quietly among themselves. None could trace its origin. It didn't match any known script entirely, yet fragments echoed older tongues, Coptic liturgy, Syriac scripture, coded Kabbalistic glyphs. It wasn't just multilingual, it was multivocal. Some even claimed the handwriting changed while under observation. The first breakthrough came not in translation, but in sound. A linguist ran the page through a phonetic AI model designed to reconstruct vocalizations from ancient scripts. The output was strange tones layered atop each other, whispers braided into syllables, harmonics that bent into inaudibility. One observer described it as reading with your ears underwater. Another likened it to Gregorian chant played in reverse at half speed. One phrase repeated not as words, but as rhythm ex umbris legitur. From the shadows it is read. Then came the stories. Each person who spent more than 2 days studying the folio claimed to experience a particular kind of dream. Not a nightmare, not a vision, but a recurring scene walking through a hallway of closed doors. Some heard murmurs behind them. Others described a sensation of being followed not malevolently, but closely, intimately, and always in the final moment, before waking the sense that one door was opening behind them. A neurologist who studied the dream reports noticed something peculiar, overlapping details among people who'd never met. Same hallway dimensions, same lighting, same peripheral figures. He concluded the folio was acting as a mnemonic conduit, something designed to implant or evoke shared mental imagery, not by suggestion, but by structure, as if the text itself wasn't meant to be read in the waking world. More chilling were the emotional effects. One student reported spontaneous recollection of events from childhood in languages she no longer spoke. Another experienced periods of time loss while staring at the page. A professor documented a 2-hour blackout, during which he copied the text by hand with perfect precision, despite not understanding a word of it. When he came to, he said, "It just wanted to be seen." Attempts to digitize the folio failed. Scanned images came out blurred. High-res photography showed only a blank page. Under UV light, the ink pulsed faintly but left no residue. A chemical analysis revealed a compound similar to iron gall, but with unidentified organic agents. The most troubling test came from a forensic specialist, who claimed that when the page was handled with heat-gloved fingers, it briefly raised its surface as if the ink rose toward the skin. And through it all, one interpretation began to form. The fragment doesn't contain information in the usual sense. It doesn't teach. It doesn't preach. It invites. Or perhaps it reproduces. The text may be a seed, a psychic virus, not malicious, not sentient, but designed to spread through cognition, memory, and imagination. Once you've seen it, truly seen it, part of you carries it forward. The implications are staggering. If the Book of Shadows is less a volume and more a ritual interface, a method encoded in partial texts, then any fragment could awaken the whole. Meaning the Inquisition didn't fail to destroy the book. It never could. Because the book, like a flame, only needs one breath, one spark to begin again. And that may be why its presence lingers, not in museums, not in libraries, but in the corners of margins, in dreams passed between strangers, in the strange pause before certain words, in the door you never meant to open but found ajar all the same. You've followed the trail through scorched pages and whispered trials, through vanished scholars, sigils carved in ash, and testimonies that bend language itself. And now, after all of it, one question returns, like a breath caught in the dark. What if we've been looking for the wrong thing? All this time we've imagined a single volume, a codex, a grimoire, something bound in leather hidden on a shelf waiting to be found. But what if that was never the truth? What if the Book of Shadows was never meant to be read? Across centuries, evidence repeats not in content, but in function. Trance states, reactive pages, fragments that refuse to be copied, memories that bloom without origin, dreams that echo across minds, all pointing to something else, something designed not to inform, but to transform. Take the sigils, the 7 circles, the ritual bindings sewn into garments and hidden inside icons. These are not illustrations. They are interfaces, not signs of a book, but elements of a practice. In this view, the so-called book becomes a ritual framework, a set of steps, symbols, sensations. Less a text, more a spell. Less a story, more a system. There's a line repeated subtly across multiple testimonies that lingers like incense in a sealed room. It begins when you forget your reading. The first time it appears is in the dying confession of Sister Benedetta, then again in the marginalia of the Codex Umbrae. Later spoken by a young novice during a 19th century exorcism when asked where she learned certain words. It begins when you forget your reading. This changes everything. It means the Book of Shadows wasn't written to be understood, but to be enacted. It was a ritual disguised as language, a memory engine built from ink and skin and time, a self-replicating mystery that could never truly be destroyed because it was never truly a thing. It was an act, a performance, a thought form that would explain the failures of the Inquisition. Not incompetence, irrelevance. They tried to burn what could not burn because it lived outside the margins, inside minds, inside dreams, inside the spaces between breath and word. The monks who copied it in secret weren't preserving a book. They were casting a net of memory across generations. The witches who spoke of it weren't quoting pages. They were reenacting fragments stored in gesture, in voice, in gaze. And the modern researchers, the ones who dreamed together, who felt watched, who saw the ink breathe, they didn't find the book. The book found them. Because perhaps that's what it was always meant to do. Not to be opened, but to open you. Not to be remembered, but to remember itself through you. Not a book, a pattern, a pulse, a shadow that leans forward when you close your eyes. Let it burn, they said. Let ash settle where memory once clung. Let the pages curl, the words fade, the leather split, and shriek in flame. Let the book vanish. And yet, here you are, listening, remembering, tracing its shape not in firelight but in the soft hush between your thoughts. Perhaps that's all it ever needed. A little space, a little stillness. The kind of quiet that the world forgets how to make. Because this was never about finding a book. It was about feeling its breath in yours. You followed the trail not just through archives and testimonies, but through doors that opened inwards. You walked the dreaming corridors of nuns and scribes, felt the pulse of ink that doesn't fade, heard the echoes of pages that whisper only when the lights go dim. And maybe now something in you feels it too. Not as fear, not as knowledge, as presence. The Book of Shadows, or whatever name it once wore, was never meant to shout. It waited in sighs, in symbols mistaken for decoration, in gestures passed from hand to hand in silence. Not a volume, a veil. And you now are on the other side, so close your eyes. Breathe gently. Let the candles gutter low. Let the last word fade like smoke through the rafters. Let it burn, yes, but let it speak. Because the truth does not live on shelves. It lives in the space where memory sleeps and dreaming begins.